On the 29th of July 1954, 53-year-old Styllou Christofi, a Greek Cypriot woman, was seen running out of the house in which she lived with her son Stavros, his wife Hella, and their 3 children in Hampstead, London, screaming, "Please come, fire burning, children sleeping." There was a raging fire in the garden of the home, and within the fire was found the charred remains of Hella Christofi, Styllou's daughter-in-law. Styllou claimed that 2 men came in, attacked Hella, dragged her out into the garden and set her on fire, while Styllou and the children were in the house. However, inconsistencies and a disturbing event from the past called Styllou's narrative into question. Hey there little berries and newberries, Eri Berry here, and I'm very sorry for the lateness of this video. I did film this a few weeks ago, but I wasn't happy with it, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to refilm it and I'm going to change it slightly because I've been sticking to the same script for several videos now. It's getting so samey, it's getting so robotic. I thought just try and talk freely rather than keep reciting, because otherwise it's just so samey. So I'm going to make it a bit different. I'm not going to go off script completely, but I'm certainly not going to stick to the same script I've been doing for several videos. First of all, thank you for clicking on this video. And also, if you're a subscriber, thank you very much for being so. If you're a channel member, thank you for being so, or a Patreon. The link for my Patreon is above or below, whichever you want to use. And if you want to join the channel as a member, which is £2.99 a month, there is a join button below. You will get early access to all my videos and member-only content, and it really helps to support me as well. Keep on making these videos. I also apologize because there is a raging storm outside, so there may be some background noise, but unfortunately I can't help that. But we'll try and get on with the video as best we can. Let's get into it. The trigger warnings for this case involves discussion of murder via very brutal and torturous methods, child marriage, poverty, clashing of cultures, volatile familial relationships, and capital punishment. There are also insinuations of class, race, age discrimination, and discrimination based on, quote, beauty ideals. There is no disrespect intended to people involved in this case. Information in this video is based on what I have researched online and in the public domain. Corrections are welcome with sources cited. Styllou Christofi was born in 1900 to a Greek Cypriot family in Cyprus. They lived in a very impoverished village in Cyprus working on an olive grove, and Styllou didn't receive a formal education and therefore was illiterate all of her life. Historian Philip Jones said that the village in which Styllou lived dealt with conflict and problems within it by dealing with them in-house. Resolutions of such problems resulted in, quote, levels of behavior or resolutions that the wider world might consider improper or unreasonable, but to the village itself were seen as entirely acceptable. An example of this will be touched on at the end of the video. At the age of 14, Styllou was married to a local man with whom she had 4 daughters and 1 son. Their son Stavros was expected to look after the family and continue the tradition of what a Greek Cypriot family should be, carry on the name, etc. In 1924, Styllou's husband left her after his mother Maria died, so this left Styllou to raise all 5 children alone. Despite the pressure on Stavros, Styllou's son, to assume his estranged father's role, he had ambitions. He didn't want to stay on the olive grove and have no ambitions or dreams, so he left his home in that village and walked over 150 miles to the capital, Nicosia. In Nicosia, he got a job as a waiter where he saved enough so that he could move from there to London. In London, he worked his way up the ladder in the capital's many restaurants, eventually earning him a senior position at the well-known Café de Paris. This was at the beginning of the Second World War, and London was being bombed left and right. But Stavros lived through this and eventually met and fell in love with German fashion model Hella Blecher. Stavros and Hella married, much to Styllou's objections. She wanted him to marry a Greek Cypriot woman. It's likely that Stavros and Styllou's exchanges over the years happened with him writing to his mother and her having someone read it to her, because he did mention that they did communicate over the following 12 years. Styllou did say she did not approve of her son marrying a German woman and not a Greek Cypriot. Stavros and Hella went on to have 3 children, and they fully embraced London life. In 1953, after 12 years apart, Styllou and Stavros were finally reunited when she moved to London. She moved in with Stavros, Hella and the children in Hampstead in London, and Stavros wanted to help his mother financially so she would get a job in London, save enough money to move back to Cyprus, and then have enough money to retire comfortably. However, when Styllou moved into Stavros's home, she made his life and the life of his wife Hella very, very difficult. Styllou spoke no English or German, and Hella spoke no Greek, so Hella and Styllou really struggled to communicate, with Stavros having to translate for both of them. Styllou did pick up some English words along the way, so she did understand a few things, but the issue wasn't actually the language barrier between these two women. It was the disparity between their views of family and tradition, and Styllou wasn't happy with her son embracing London life and living a typically London life with his children and wife. Styllou also strongly disagreed with how her grandchildren were being parented by Hella. Styllou wanted her grandchildren raised in accordance with Greek Cypriot customs and preferably in their homeland. Here, they were being raised typically as Londoners, and Styllou felt that her children were being spoiled. She also alleged that Hella was squandering family money on fashion and makeup, which again she disapproved of. Styllou and Hella were at loggerheads, arguing and fighting over family values, and things got so volatile on a number of occasions that Styllou moved out of the home to live elsewhere. However, every time Styllou moved into somewhere new, she was kicked out and she had to go back to her son's house. Each time, it was her temper and attitude that put her on the wrong foot with people. Eventually, Hella had had enough. She and Stavros had a conversation in July 1954, which they had in English as their native tongues were different. Although it is not known for sure, as Styllou had learned enough English to understand the general concept of the conversation, she knew what her son and daughter-in-law were planning. Hella gave Stavros an ultimatum. She was taking the children to her family to visit them in Germany, and by the time she came back, she wanted her mother-in-law gone. Stavros agreed. But Styllou Christofi, however, she wasn't going to let that happen. Before this trip to Germany could take place, after Stavros had left to go to work late in the evening of the 29th of July in 1954, and after the three children had been sent to bed, Hella and Styllou were alone in the house. Hella was going about her normal domestic chores and was preparing to have a wash. Styllou went into the kitchen and got out a heavy cast iron ashpan from under the oven. She walked up behind Hella and hit her on the back of the head with all her might. The blow to the head was so severe that it fractured Hella's skull, but she was at this stage still alive. Styllou dragged her daughter-in-law into the kitchen, and using a scarf that belonged to one of the children, she wrapped it around Hella's neck. Using this scarf, Styllou Christofi strangled her daughter-in-law Hella to death. In fact, Styllou used such force that the material embedded itself into the 36-year-old Hella's neck, and Styllou had to use scissors to cut it off of her. After killing Hella, Styllou removed Hella's wedding ring, wrapped it in paper, and then secreted it in her room. After this, Styllou dragged Hella's body into the back garden, covered it in paraffin and newspaper, and set her daughter-in-law's body on fire. Hella Christofi was dead, having been strangled to death by her mother-in-law, and her body was now being burned in the garden. Neighbour John Young was taking his dog for one last walk before going to bed when he noticed the fire. He looked through a gap in the fence and saw what he thought was a dressmaker's mannequin being burned. This was what John Young thought because he knew that Hella worked at a fashion shop, and so he thought that Hella was just burning old items. John Young went back to walking his dog, but he did notice that there was someone standing there that wasn't Hella nor Stavros. This person was a short, middle-aged woman, and John Young saw that this woman was stoking the fire, not making any attempt to put it out. Styllou watched Hella burn, hoping that the fire would destroy any evidence or completely destroy Hella's body. But Styllou had stoked the fire a bit too much, and it was coming closer to the house. It was at this point that Hella ran into the road and stopped someone in the street saying, "Please come, fire burning, children sleeping." The fire brigade was called, and when the fire was put out, they saw the burned body of a young woman. This was the dead and burned body of 36-year-old mother of three, Hella Christofi. The fire brigade did not have to look far to see that Hella had sustained a serious head wound which had resulted in her being covered in blood. The blood was still visible despite the fact that she'd been on fire, and they also saw evidence of strangulation. Hella Christofi had been murdered, and her murderer had attempted to cover it up with fire. Hella was also not wearing her wedding ring, and Stavros confirmed that her ring would require considerable force to remove. The police conducted a search of the house once the children were safely elsewhere, and in Stylou's room, they found behind her dresser Hella's wedding ring, wrapped in paper. When Styllou was asked why this was in her room, Styllou said that she thought that this was a curtain ring. She said she just found it on the floor, picked it up, wrapped it in paper and put it behind her dresser. However, none of the curtains in the house were hung using curtain rings, and there were no other curtain rings in the house. So why would Styllou pick up something that she thought was a curtain ring and hide it? Styllou was taken in for questioning, and through an interpreter, this is what she told the police. Styllou was asleep and was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of two male voices coming from downstairs. Styllou heard something in the garden and looked out the window, where she saw a man setting Hella's body on fire. The men then fled, leaving Hella's body to burn in the back garden. Styllou said she tried to put the fire out with water, which didn't work, and the fire was out of control, so she ran outside to get help. This was not an account that aligned itself with the evidence. For one thing, paraffin was found on the soles of Styllou's shoes that matched the paraffin on Hella's body. Styllou argued this away by saying that some paraffin had been spilt in the house the day before and she'd walked in it. However, there was no sign of any paraffin being spilled in the house. John Young testified that he saw Styllou in the back garden and she wasn't putting out the fire. She was stoking the fire. He also testified that at one point she went back into the house once she knew that John was looking, and then was looking at him through the window. She wasn't showing any distress or concern that her daughter-in-law was on fire. The wedding ring was also not something that could easily be explained, as it would never have come loose from Hella's finger. Somebody must have forced it off. On Styllou's shoes, as well as the paraffin, traces of blood were also found. When Stavros returned home and found out that his wife and the mother of his children was dead, he knew that it was his mother's doing. He told the police about the volatile relationship that Hella and Styllou had. The two women had violent disagreements over parenting, the house decor, that Stavros was not staying true to his Greek Cypriot roots. In view of the physical and circumstantial evidence, Styllou was arrested and placed on remand at Holloway Prison. Whilst on remand, she was charged with Hella Christofi's murder, and her son, Stavros, disowned his mother. While Styllou's trial was pending, her defense tried to have her plead insanity, for they believed she was not in her right mind. If she pleaded insanity, this meant that she would not receive the death penalty. When interpreted from English, the term insanity meant crazy, and this carried with it a stigma at the time. Styllou refused, saying that while she was poor and illiterate, she wasn't crazy. Whilst in Holloway, Styllou was assessed by their mental health team, who said that yes, she was insane, but not in the legal sense, so they couldn't use that as a defense. The team said that Styllou's mental illness was that of a delusional or paranoid disorder. She felt that her grandchildren were not being well brought up in England and would be better put in the charge of Styllou. They said she was fit to stand trial, which she did, with Styllou sticking to her story that two men broke into the house and murdered Hella. The trial took place in the October following Hella's murder at the Old Bailey, and despite the defense team doing their best, Styllou Christofi was found guilty. In the 1950s, death was the automatic sentence for murder, and this was the sentence passed on Styllou Christofi. However, it was also law at the time for a person sentenced to death to be determined if they are actually insane. This had already been done at Holloway Prison before Styllou's trial, and they deemed her to be delusional or paranoid. But she was assessed again after her sentence, and the conclusions were that there was no mental health issue, so there was no recommendation for reprieve. Styllou Christofi, though, did have her supporters, and several MPs tried to get the death sentence overturned because they believed that the psychiatrist's conclusion was not correct. They said that given that Styllou did not plead insanity when this could have saved her, that showed that she was actually not of sound mind. Despite the support she had, this proved fruitless, and Styllou Christofi was hanged at Holloway Prison on the 15th of December 1954. Her last wish was for a cross to be placed in the hanging cell so it would be visible in her line of sight just before she died, and her wish was granted. Styllou Christofi was the penultimate woman in the UK to be hanged, the last of whom was Ruth Ellis. Stavros Christofi did not stand by his mother, nor did he visit her in prison. His own mother had murdered his wife, despite them both welcoming his mother into their home. One of his sons, Toby Christofi, grew up having doubts about his grandmother's guilt. He felt that prejudices at the time skewed the trial, and the media showed different attitudes towards Styllou Christofi that they did Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis was a young, blonde and typically beautiful woman, and this meant that she gained much sympathy and attention from the press. Styllou Christofi was older, foreign, illiterate and not considered conventionally attractive, so the media did not give her a lot of attention. However, this did not stop Ruth Ellis from being hanged for murdering her lover, David Blakely. David Blakely was also murdered just down the road from where Hella Christofi was murdered. The same cross that Styllou Christofi asked be placed in the hanging cell was still there when Ruth Ellis was hanged. The death penalty was suspended in 1965, abolished in 1969, and now it is actually illegal for the UK to reintroduce it. Since the 1950s, psychology has come on leaps and bounds, and Styllou Christofi's case was featured in the BBC series Murder, Mystery and My Family in 2019. This documentary is no longer available on BBC iPlayer, nor is it on YouTube, Dailymotion or any other platform that I could find. I did nonetheless find a clip and articles on the episode, and it confirmed Toby Christofi, Styllou Christofi's grandson, had contacted the show to help prove her innocence. It's unclear from the clip and the articles if Toby thought that his grandmother was de facto responsible or not, or whether it's a case of she was insane and therefore not guilty by reason of insanity. He had consulted lawyers because he was concerned with how Styllou Christofi was treated, and he was hoping to have her conviction posthumously overturned. The BBC investigation team put the evidence to a judge who deemed Styllou's sentence and conviction to not have been unsafe. The reasons for this is because whilst many people that commit murder have some mental health issues in some capacity, to be deemed legally insane at the time of the crime was committed is another thing. According to the Insanity in English Law page on Wikipedia, insanity in English law is a defense to criminal charges based on the idea that the defendant was unable to understand what he was doing, or that he was unable to understand that what he was doing was wrong. Although this uses male pronouns, this would of course pertain to anybody regardless of gender. Styllou Christofi was likely mentally unwell, but not in the legal sense, so she did know what she was doing was wrong, hence why she denied it and tried to cover it up. So whilst there was indeed some sympathy conveyed by the judge for how Styllou was treated, there was no doubt as to her guilt, and so her conviction and sentence were not deemed to be unsafe. However, the case does not end there. As is many a case, when you find out about your family, you may find out more than you thought, and some may make you feel worse. Toby Christofi consulted a barrister who was able to uncover some letters. One of them confirms something very shocking about Toby's family. The letter was written by Stavros' first cousin to Stavros' aunt, and it stated the following: "My respected aunt in Alexandria, I greet you. I have some very bad news for you. On the afternoon of the 29th of September 1924, your mother, she was killed by her daughters-in-law and her neighbour. Those three entered her house and threw her to the ground and started hitting her with anything they could lay their hands on. They took burning pieces of wood and put them in her mouth and down her throat." So Hella Christofi was not Styllou's first murder. She had murdered before. She had murdered her own mother-in-law, Maria Christofi, along with her sister and neighbour. They had beaten Maria and forced pieces of burning wood into her mouth and down her throat. And it turned out the reason for this killing was because Maria Christofi, Toby's great-grandmother, herself was a murderer. She and her lover had murdered her husband, Toby's great-grandfather, in 1911, and had seemingly got away with it. The wider family may have collectively agreed on how they would avenge this death, as Maria had brought such shame on the family. They may have decided Maria had to die, and Styllou, her sister-in-law and her neighbour had been instructed by other family members to do this. The three women were arrested and put on trial, but were ultimately acquitted due to lack of evidence and that they all covered for one another. This incident was not revealed to the jury or to the media at the time of Styllou's trial for Hella's murder because they felt it might affect the jury's decision. If you remember earlier in the video, I said that Styllou's husband left her. It was Maria's murder, Styllou's husband's own mother, that caused him to leave. Even if the killing of Maria was sanctioned by the wider family, Styllou's husband did not forgive her for this and walked out on his wife and his children. As previously stated, Styllou came from a community where violent retribution for betrayals and shameful acts were accepted. And so this was, in consequence, an honour killing. It is likely that this is what motivated Styllou to murder Hella, but also due to jealousy that Stavros had effectively chosen Hella over his mother. As the man of his family, he was expected and required to take care of his parents. But before Hella could go to Germany to see her family, he had agreed that Styllou should go back to Cyprus, leaving Stavros, Helen and the children to live out their typically English lifestyle. Whilst there was definite racism here with the coverage of the case in the media, which made much of Styllou being a foreigner and poor, she was still a murderer. You may or may not be pro-death penalty, but the fact that both Styllou Christofi and Ruth Ellis were both convicted and hanged based on the reliability of the evidence for their crimes showed that it was indeed due to justice and not media bias. Either way, convicted or not, it is unacceptable for someone to be treated the way Styllou was by the media. Public judgment based on looks, happenstance of genetics and ethnicity should not have any part in the justice system. This is why juries are required to not read, listen, watch nor discuss anything about the case other than what they hear in court and convict or acquit based on the strength of the evidence. That concludes this case. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you're well wherever you are. Just a reminder that you can join the channel as a member or just subscribe, which is free. That really does help me out. Give me a like and give me a comment. Share this video if you can. Help this channel grow, and I really appreciate your support. Thank you very much, little berries. Bye.